Today's lecture, we're going to look at some of the issues and cultural aspects that led the colonists into open rebellion, right, against the British Empire. You know, there's many different things that define the American Revolution that help explain it. And again, what we're trying to get at in this topic and all of the topics up until this point is trying to wrap our heads around why in the mid to late 18th century did this otherwise stable and prosperous and fairly independent colonial society go into open rebellion against England, right? Against the actual institutions that made them prosperous and stable. And there's a couple different ways to look at this, right? We have, you know, the American Revolution. We can certainly look at it from its ideological origins that come from the Enlightenment, that come from British political Whiggish history out of the Glorious Revolution and the sense of a Bill of Rights. That is certainly an important part of the revolution, and I would never splice it out or say that it isn't. It's not what we're going to focus on today. There's religious elements, which is the subject of another lecture, and the Great Awakening. But first and foremost, and to any military action, any revolution, first and foremost, they are a sustained act of violence, successful violence. It's a war, right? And the American Revolution would be won or lost based over the colonists' ability to sustain and maintain effective collective acts of violence. And I want to look a little bit at why the colonists were so prepared to enact these acts of violence, why they were so ready to marshal their forces and to be ready, just basically to be ready to stand up to the British, and why they reacted so quickly, so effectively, so efficiently, and so violently to the British imperial policies post-1763. One of the things that we do know about colonial America in the 18th century is that it may have been the most militarily experienced population in the world at that time. You know, England fights a series of wars, an endless series of wars that are connected to wars on the continent between 1689, the Glorious Revolution, all the way up to 1763, right? And all of those wars have a North American component, usually with the English and the English colonists fighting against the French, the Spanish, and various Native American allies. And because of this, right, the English main focus was always on the continent or around Europe. That's where the main body of England's military forces would be. They relied heavily on colonial support. And by colonial support, I mean actual colonial volunteers, people who lived in the colonies volunteering to be parts of these war efforts. And it is estimated that by 1763, you know, 1/3 of all men in New England, specifically New England, because that's a very militarily active area of the colonies, 1/3 of all men in New England had military experience, had fought in these wars. And close to 1/4 of the men throughout all of the colonies between the ages of, you know, 16 and 30 had experience fighting alongside British professional regulars, right? They all owned weaponry. So from a pure military standpoint, at the start of the Revolution, the colonists are well armed, they're skilled at working together in sort of cooperative acts of military violence, much more so than, you know, almost any other group of people on the planet who were not also professional soldiers. So that's a big part of the story. It's not actually going to be the main focus of the story today, but it certainly plays into this. It is certainly one half of how we explain the colonists' military preparedness, right, in terms of their cultural willingness and ability to go to war and sustain a fairly effective war effort starting right in 1775 all the way through the early 1780s. The second question we have to ask, though, is there another aspect to this culture? Is there another aspect to the colonial sort of communal, cooperative culture of violence that goes beyond or lies outside of this specific military experience? Today's lecture, I'm going to argue that there is, in fact, and we're going to look at several episodes that I hope illustrate this culture that I want to get a hold of. And there's a couple of key things I want to keep in mind as we look at these examples from 18th century colonial history. One, I want you to pay attention to the very focused aspect of the violence. We're going to see episodes where communities or certain areas of the colonies quickly respond to threats, to dangers, to impositions against their rights. And they do it with collective acts of violence. However, in almost every case, it'll be very different than what we talked about in Bacon's Rebellion, where these acts of violence were cathartic and chaotic and almost leaderless, where they just attacked symbols of wealth or, all that sort of class tension, right? That these, instead, what we'll see is that there's a much more efficacious, by that I mean they saw it trying to be pragmatically effective, applications of communal violence, where they will address these threats using weaponry and violence and intimidation. They will do it quickly and effectively. And what's really interesting is when these threats are met, when they felt that they had achieved what they wanted to do, they disband. The violence ceases. They go back to living everyday, stable, normal colonial lives. In fact, that the main goal for all of these acts of violence isn't to overturn colonial society or to, fundamentally alter the society they lived in to prevent these threats from happening. Rather, they're mostly done to preserve what they already have, this sort of stable, prosperous society, or their sense of rights. And this feeds into another question. When people look at the American Revolution, historians look at the American Revolution, in many ways, it is a departure from other major social or even colonial revolutions, right? It is not incredibly destructive, right? That the colonists, after the revolution, do not tear down, right, the society they rebel against. In many ways, they prop it up. They recreate it, right? There are certain elements that they're willing to fight a protracted, extensive, destructive war for almost 8 years, and yet at the end, they worked very hard to preserve what they were fighting against, to preserve the rights and the institutions they believed they already had. And, this is notable. There's people who question whether or not this is a revolution at all, right? That how is this really a revolution? I would maintain it is a revolution because the goals of egalitarianism and anti-monarchy and democracy do come to fruition for the first time in modern history, and they leave a lasting impression. The revolutionary nature of this is clear. However, it is more of a revolution in moderation, or a moderate revolution. I wouldn't even use the word conservative revolution, but there is a sort of moderation, a restraint on this sort of collective violence. And again, just to put this in a historical context, shortly after the American Revolution, we have the French Revolution. And later on in history, you have the revolutions like the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, and in modern times, the Iranian Revolution. And all of them follow a similar pattern, where you have these enlightened leadership or ideologically driven leadership that unleashes the passions of the masses, of the populace, in a violent, and tries to direct their violence towards an institution or society or government they're seeking to overthrow or replace. And in all cases, they run into one of the great conundrums of revolutions, right? Once you unleash the violent passions, right, of the mob, of the populace, when the revolution is over, how do you rein them in, right? How do you stop this sort of destructive, complete removal of civilization? And the way it usually happens is the leadership of the revolution becomes somewhat of a dictatorship itself. And it uses violence and intimidation or secret police or a terror, right, to rein in the passions of the mob. And that is how that goes. And the American Revolution seems to take a slightly different trajectory. That the American Revolution, they unleashed the passions, certainly, of the patriots and the loyalists, right, in a violent struggle. And yet, by 1781, after the Battle of Yorktown, 2 years before the Treaty of Paris, the fighting stops, right? Wanton destruction stops. They get very quickly about the business of building a stable society, creating these state constitutions, making, viable democratic governments becomes almost immediately the focus of a people whose focus had been direct applications of extensive warfare. And there's something within already existing, I would argue, in colonial culture that helps condition this end, this aspect, and frankly, this very successful part of the American Revolution. It is how this revolution leads rather quickly to stability and preservation as opposed to chaos and a ripping away of what came before. And it's embedded in the colonial cultural experience in the 18th century. And so what I would like to do is to go over some examples now to sort of highlight what I'm talking about. The first thing I want to talk about is an episode in American history, early American history. Happens around 1739. It's a slave rebellion. You've certainly read about this in your text. It's called the Stono Rebellion. And I'm not really going to talk about this in terms of what it means to slavery and slave rebellions. As I said in a previous lecture, you know, the American colonies, what becomes the actual United States of America, right? Slavery there is somewhat remarkable for its lack of open rebellions and insurrections, certainly compared to the West Indies and to Brazil. The Stono Rebellion is one of the largest ones, and it involves ultimately about 100 slaves. And the story is this, is that in 1739, a group of about 20 slaves made a very organized decision that they go and they attack, they raid a gun and ammunition store about 20 miles outside of Charlestown, South Carolina. And they arm themselves and they begin marching south towards Florida. And the reason why they wanted to go to Florida is because they knew any escaped slaves that could get to Florida. Florida is controlled by the Spanish at this point in time. And any escaped slaves, the Spanish had promised this, who made it to Florida from the British colonies was given their freedom. And not only were they given their freedom, they were armed. And they had the ability to join an entity that became known as the Black Maroons. A Maroon just means almost any community of escaped slaves. But the Maroons of Florida were highly militarized, and they weren't directly controlled by the Spanish. They had sworn allegiance to the Spanish king, but they were actually an independent, basically armed militia of ex-slaves. And they would later on raid settlements in Georgia and in South Carolina. So anyway, this is fairly early on in their development, but it's apparent that the Stono rebels are heading in that direction. Along the way, they sack and burn some 7 rice plantations, liberating the slaves there. They end up killing about 20 whites, including one very well-liked Scottish innkeeper, because they raid this one inn as well, a man who was, by all accounts, reported to be good to his slaves, and he was popular, but nonetheless, he dies, about 19 other whites, and ultimately their numbers swell to about 100. They end up with about 100 slaves, fairly well armed, heading south towards Florida. And recent historiography has taken a closer look at the Stono rebels. And what they've brought to light is that in all actuality, if we look at how organized they were, how purposeful their plans were, their nature of their movements, their ability to communicate, there's a lot of belief that these slaves were not just ordinary slaves, but they had come from a part of West Africa that was highly engaged in basically African nation-state warfare, that these were ex-soldiers. They had been captured soldiers and sold into slavery. They came in a very specific way. And so they're very martially skilled. These are not just unskilled slaves running for their freedom. They had a plan. They had ability. This is all a fascinating story in and of itself. But what I want to bring to light is the colonial response. So within one day, alarm goes out through South Carolinian society. The colonial settlers, and by this I mean mostly small subsistence farmers, put together a militia. And a militia is volunteer citizens arming themselves for some legal purpose, right, to enact collective violence. They quickly track down the Stono rebels, and there's about 100 of these militiamen. So it's 100 on 100 in a fairly even battle, to be quite honest. And they wipe out the Stono rebels. They actually, they corner them. They effectively outmaneuver them. They cut them to ribbons. They do some fairly brutal things. It's said that with the Stono rebels, they could capture, kill, they behead them. And on the road back to Charleston, along every milepost, and a milepost is just what you think it is. Every mile you put a post so you know how close you are getting to your destination. They put the head of one of the Stono rebels. And they spent the next week kind of traveling around South Carolina, putting down other smaller rebellions that had popped up. And once that was done, they disband. They go back basically to their farms, to their everyday work, right? And what I want to kind of bring to light is this, a couple of things. One, from the grand history of slavery, after this point in time, the laws of the South will harden. There will be much more hardened slave codes. This is that I talked about in a previous lecture about this surveillance society. Well, they become very apprehensive about this, right? Because this is an actual insurrection. Slaves are not allowed to leave plantations, right? And their movements are always marked. People can be punished. Your owners will be punished if your slave is somewhere they shouldn't be. And, you know, the collective settlers, the white settler population, will actually take an active role in enforcing those laws. These are the slave codes that impose curfews and movement restrictions and actually have penalties for owner and slave alike. But I also want to point out how quickly, listen, there's no police force in South Carolina. There's no military force. All law and order, all stability comes from citizens, these fairly well-armed citizens who are farmers. They're not ex-soldiers. This is early on. And it's shocking how quickly they responded to this threat, organized themselves collectively, and addressed the need, met on a battle, taking risk of their own lives. Remember, the men who got together to do this are not themselves slave owners, right? But they saw this as a threat to their civilization, their society, their biological well-being. They feared death, and they organized quickly and effectively and martially without really much of a second thought. The call went out and it happened. It shows you how ingrained this is even very early on in the 18th century. But they don't, after the end of the Stono Rebellion, we see a hardening in the laws, but we don't see this sort of reflexive going from slave settlement to slave settlement, murder of slaves. It actually doesn't happen. There's an offshoot a year later in New York City where there's some hysteria about a slave insurrection, but that even has limits on how far that goes as well. What's notable about this is not just the purposefulness of the violence and the speed of it, but the moderation and the restraint that was built into these collective acts of efficacious communal violence. Right? And I'd like to point that out. This is part of colonial culture. And this is just one example. There's lots of different ways we can look at the Stono Rebellion and discuss slave rebellion in general. But for today's lecture, this is the part I wanted to focus on. Another thing, areas that is, and it's even closer to the heart of the revolution, that's very prevalent in the 18th century colony, are land riots, or what are known sometimes as, we call it squatter resistance. You know, there's a very old Saturday Night Live bit about who the squatters were, and if you YouTube it, it's very funny and it's worth watching. But squatter just refers to anyone who settles on land and farms it, even though they don't have title to it, right? They're not necessarily the legal owners, but they live on it. Sometimes they might live on that land for generations and farm it. And what happens is they run into some legal problems. Other people have a legal claim or a deed claim to the land they're on. Right? And that tension, you know, it's sort of the battle between the landowners and those who squat on the land, right? You have to understand that in the 18th century, land is precious. And the understandings of who owns land are not as hard and fast as they are today. You know, even within English common law, which the settlers operated under, there's a lot of, you know, merely holding a title to a land did not necessarily mean you owned it. There's also a lot of room given to who works the land, how long they've been on the land, right? How old is the title? These things weren't cut and dry. They are somewhat unclear. And by the middle of the 18th century, good land was becoming more and more rare. And there's a lot more competition to find good farmable land. And I'll be very specific. Where we see these squatters' rebellions and squatters' resistance is in the eastern part of the colonies. You know, this goes back to our first geography lecture, right? but that the most important thing, it wasn't just enough to have fertile land, although fertile land is your primary concern, but also is a major concern is you had to have access to markets, right? This is people who wanted to be market farmers. They wanted to be able to sell a certain portion of their surplus in an open market, in a global colonial market, right? That really is the cutting edge of economics in the colonies. It was the real baseline reason that the colonies were stable and wealthy. And so being able to access that, to be part of this market farming, is the number one desire of most of the people in the colonies. And in order to do that, you had to be on fertile land, and you had to be land that was, on large navigable rivers or close to those, near cities and towns on the seaboard, right? This is, because pretty much all of the good land east of the Appalachians was occupied, right? And you could be like the backcountry settlers. You could be the Scots-Irish who settle along the Piedmont and the foothills of the Appalachians, all up and down the western parts of the colonies. And that's fine. But you would almost be reduced to only subsistence farming. You really couldn't participate effectively in market farming. And so we see a lot of competition around land. There's a couple different places this pops up. In the 1740s, we'll see groups of people who move onto land in northern New Jersey. And they will claim they have title to the land, and the land had pretty much been unused. However, there will be some people who, from an early period of time, actually did have legal title to the land. When they become aware of these people squatting on their land, they go to the colonial authorities and send sheriffs and people out to collect rents from them, because that's what they would expect. They weren't even trying to kick them off. They just wanted rents from people who were profiting on their land. And what's amazing is the response of these squatters. Basically, anyone who comes out and tries to collect rent from them, they will intimidate. They will beat them up. They will drive them out. They will use collective communal violence, both in a secret, intimidating, almost terroristic way, as well as sort of an open standoffs against colonial authorities or agents of the landowners to preserve their land. And what's interesting is, over time, most of those squatters in New Jersey are actually able to hold this land. They create enough of a problem, and colonial authorities are not interested enough in really driving them off, that they do gain title to the land. That these land riots, the ones in northern New Jersey, tend out to be successful. And once they achieve their needs, they don't continue to be violent people. They don't continue to use collective violence against anybody to not pay any bills, right? They really had a very focused goal about defending their claim, their title to this land that they believe they own because they worked it and lived on it and no one else was using it. And once that need is met, that right is addressed, the collective violence subsides. A larger and more interesting one is actually up in Vermont. Vermont isn't a colony. In fact, Vermont doesn't have any legal identity at all until the middle of the Revolution. It gets declared a state, and it is recognized by the Continental Congress as a state. And the territory of Vermont is actually claimed by two colonies. Both New Hampshire and New York claim Vermont. And what happens is this: in the 1740s and 50s, people from Massachusetts and New Hampshire move into Vermont. And the reason they move into Vermont, or the area that will become Vermont, is because Massachusetts has suffered this horrible land crush. We think, especially those of us who live in the Pioneer Valley, of Massachusetts as this really vibrant farming community. And actually, in the Pioneer Valley, it still is. But however, by this point in time, by the mid-18th century, most farms in Massachusetts have gone belly up. The heavy grain production had depleted the nutrients of the soil of much of Massachusetts, and many farms were being abandoned. Plus, the large families of those first, second, and third generations of Puritans had divided up the land to the point where there really isn't a lot of available land to meet the population's demand for land. And we see a big migration of New England families, whole families, just like when they migrated as families from England to New England to be farmers, to be market farmers. They start to move to other parts of the colonies as families to continue to participate in market farming. And one of the areas they will settle will be along the Connecticut River and different riverways in Vermont. They get title to the land from New Hampshire. The problem is New York doesn't recognize those titles, right? The colonies don't always work together, right? They were and many times opposed to each other. And these wealthy landowners in New York actually go and press their claims, try to kick these settlers off the land in what will become Vermont. And they actually get backed with sort of policing forces by New York authorities. New Hampshire will give up claim to the land. They won't press this. They kind of leave those farmers there to themselves. Those farmers actually get together and they form a guerrilla army, a rather famous one that comes up again in the Revolution called the Green Mountain Boys, named after the mountain ranges they were living around. The Green Mountain Boys. And these guys, starting around 1769, all the way up and into the Revolution, will fight a protracted guerrilla war against New York. New York will actually send over their own militias, policing forces to try to drive them off the land. But these guys, who are all farmers, again, they're not military men. Many of them may have had military experience, but their main occupation is going back to their farms, engaging in stable communal activities, but they also will arm themselves and do secret attacks or sneak woods attacks against the forces from New York. And they are actually able to drive out New York's authority. They are able to maintain this, their autonomy. And as a matter of fact, they'll be quite opportunist. They will align themselves with the Continental Congress in their struggle, in their patriot struggle against England. The Green Mountain Boys themselves will actually be very important militarily to helping the Patriots win the North, right? They defeat the forces of John Burgoyne at Bennington when he's trying to forage and get out of Ticonderoga. It's actually Ethan Allen of Furniture Mogul fame and his Green Mountain Boys actually drive them back, right? So they are actually a very effective fighting force. And in fact, in the 1770s, they will be formally recognized as a state, and from their ranks will come the government of that state. They will draft a constitution. This is where Vermont comes from, right? It's the truly revolutionary state. It's created by this sort of collective, focused, efficacious, militia-based resistance, right, over land, over title to land. It's basically a squatters' riot that yields us a state. And again, what's important to know, the Green Mountain Boys are a pretty effective fighting force and fierce in defense of what they see as their traditional landed rights, the rights to occupy and govern this area and resist outside authority. They see the New York proprietors and their agents as an outside external force. And they actually branch that out later to seeing the British forces as the same way, because that they would have lost their title to their land. But again, Vermont doesn't descend into a military junta or what we see in other places where we have revolutionary guerrilla war going on throughout human history. It's a model of stability like everywhere else in the early national period. The Green Mountain Boys quickly returned to becoming the Green Mountain farmers of sober and serious and stable concerns, right? And again, the way they reacted to colonial authority, to the external efforts of faraway landowners to drive them off what they saw as their traditional English right to be on this land and farm it, right? That's part of their culture. It's amazing how quickly they react, how they organize, how much they are willing to both kill and be killed to press these concerns as a community. We don't see this everywhere. And yet, it's not a passionate response. It's a pragmatic response. They have specific goals. They aren't invading New Hampshire and New York, right? They don't find every wealthy landowner they can and kill them and take their land, right? They're really just defending their rights and their concerns. And once that need is met, especially after the Revolution, they disband. They go back to everyday life. Stability has been achieved. Another land riot, probably the biggest of the land riots, happened in the Hudson Valley area of New York. And the Hudson Valley, New York, just so we know what we're talking about where the Hudson River runs from about northern Westchester all the way up to Albany, if you guys can picture where that would be, all along the I-87 corridor. And, the Hudson River, has it's a mighty river, right? It's a very navigable river. It's wide, its flow. You can get up and down. There's a lot of commerce on it. And the land immediately to either side is quite fertile. Most of that land was owned by a small number of people, a small number of men. Going back to almost the late 17th century, they had title to this land because of their allegiance to the British governors. And they're collectively called the patroons. The patroons. And these guys are large landowners who own huge, and I mean vast, mile upon square mile of land up and down the Hudson Valley. And they're small in number. And they are actually probably next to the rice plantation owners of South Carolina, the wealthiest people in the colonies. Except they make their money from a very old-fashioned way, right? A very long-standing way. They own all this land, and the way they make money on it is they rent it out. They rent it to families who live there, farm on it, participate in market farming, which makes sense because they're right on the Hudson River, right? It's a great place to be a family participating in market farming. Originally, all the settlers there are Dutch and German, right? They are the initial settlers. However, starting in the 1730s, again, we talked about the problems in New England, particularly Massachusetts, with a scarcity of quality, fertile farmland and a large, ever-growing population. We see, just as we saw in Vermont, a huge migration of New England families to the Hudson Valley. And what happens is this, is that the land of the patroons is so vast, a lot of it's unsettled. A lot of it has no one living on it, right? On a map, they have, they could show you what they own, but there's not necessarily roads to it or towns, right? It's sort of unimproved land. And the New England families will occupy this land. They will occupy it, they will cultivate it, and they will actually turn it into fairly successful market-oriented family farms. What happens is, around the 1760s, the patroons, these landowners, become very aware that these New Englanders in huge numbers have set up whole communities on their land. And sure enough, what they do is they go and they press their claims. They say, listen, either you guys got to get off the land or you pay us rent like everyone else. The New Englanders will instantly react violently. They will get together as a very organized community, and the range of the responses go from terrorizing the other loyal tenants in the area, the Dutch and German ones, to scare them off the land. They will beat and sometimes murder, agents and representatives of the governments working on behalf of the patroons. They will actually have an open, almost insurrection fight with a sheriff and a large posse that had been brought to drive one of the whole communities off. And in fact, they will very successfully throughout the 1760s resist any incursion or attempt to push them off their land or force them to pay rents. And eventually, this ends in the late 1760s. The patroons were able to actually get the British government to supply professional British soldiers, a large regiment out of New York City, to put down this squatter rebellion in the Hudson River Valley, these land riots. And they do, right? They actually, as strong as these New England settlers are in their resolve, they are not able really yet and prepared to stand up to professional British soldiers. And their leaders are captured and imprisoned, and the riot is put down. What's important to note is, again, it's their willingness to go to great lengths against all sorts of authority, outside authority, legal authority, economic authority, to preserve what they see as their essential English rights, their right to farm, to settle this land, to be here, and to do it as a communal effort. Right? Again, these are just farming families who moved out there who, like that, when a threat is presented to them, organize into a fairly militarily capable militia to press their concerns. As far as their success, the rebellion is put down. However, over the course, because fairly soon afterwards, the American Revolution breaks out. The patroons, by and large, are loyalists. They end up being on the wrong side of this. By the late 1770s, early 1780s, these New England settlers are still on this land and ultimately do claim title to it, and they do define the communities that evolve in the Hudson River Valley after that point. again, it's another point was that I want to bring up is not only were they ready to enact this sort of focused, purposeful, pragmatic communal violence, was that often they were rewarded for their efforts. You know, the nature of society was then, without you know, a standing police force and the sort of implements of militarized tyranny in the colonies, this works. You know, by and large, these resistance works. They do stop slave rebellions, right? They do enable you to press your land claims against external powers. They do lead to the founding of Vermont and determine who ultimately owns the Hudson River Valley. So there's a pattern of, like I say, it's efficacious, it's effective, it works. That's part of what sustains a culture too. Cultural attributes don't just exist a priori and they do them anyway, right? If they don't work, if every time there was collective communal violence, they were all crushed and they lost everything they had, it wouldn't happen. It's why it doesn't happen as much in Europe or places where concentrated power had the ability to prevent it from happening. The third example I want to go to, just because it takes us to another region again, is a movement called the Regulator movement. Regulator. And these take shape, again, between the 1660s to the 1770s. What's good about these two is they're all kind of centered right at the point in time when the colonial powder keg is about to get hit with the spark of the American Revolution. And this all feeds into it. But the Regulators, and the Regulator movement is actually two separate things that happen. There's one in North Carolina and one in South Carolina. The South Carolina one, which again is in the 1760s and into the early 1770s. Actually, before I do this, I need to talk about a fundamental, and this comes up again in the early national period, so it's good to talk about this now. You know, the fundamental division in the colonies and in the early national period up until probably 1800s, the early 1800s, is not North and South. Right? The big cultural and political divide in the colonies and the early national period is not North versus South. In fact, it's East versus West. East versus West. East and West. And the reason for this is geographic. You know, in each and every colony, you have, you know, if this is the seaboard, right? If you were in South Carolina, but this is true for Massachusetts, it's true in New York, along the seaboard, you have your capital cities and your big towns, right? You'd have Charleston and what have you. And most of your navigable rivers are widest as they hit the ocean. So most of the commerce, right? Most of the political power and the influential parts of your population live in the eastern part of the state. They will dominate the economics. They will dominate the institutions. They will get the lion's share of you know, tax money spent on them, because there are taxes in the colonial era that all the assemblies enact. And so, you know, where you're going to see, you know, the greatest effort put forth by government and economics will be in the eastern part of the state. However, all through the 18th century, we know along the western parts of the state and the frontiers, right, they've been settled by all these Scotch-Irish settlers. There's all these backcountry farms have sprung up, and their populations are actually fairly large. You know, in some states, these populations, and colonies I should say, rival those of the East. But because of where they are and their lack of economic dynamism, they lack political influence, right? They are often people in the East will, in fact, business interests and banking interests and political interests will basically collude to, you know, steal tax money from the West, spend it in the East with very little coming back. And there's a lot of things that go into this. So the Regulator movement is one of the first times we see this fundamental divide, East versus West, in the colonies come to a fore. You know, we will see this again in the 1780s with Shays' Rebellion, the 1790s with the Whiskey Rebellion, right? This fundamental division, this regional division, which is mostly a function of geography and early infrastructure or lack thereof, East versus West, that defines this early period. So the Regulators. In South Carolina, the people along the frontier had a big problem with banditry. You know, one of the things about not being near the eastern part of the states is you don't have the infrastructures of law and order. There's no courts. There's no jails. There's no policing forces. And many of these farms or small communities are somewhat isolated from one another, and they were easy targets for bandits. There's a lot of roving bands of, and they could be mixed race, they could be black maroons, they could be Native Americans, and they could just be bands of basically backcountry white colonists who would sack and burn and rob and steal from these other settlements, right? It's a real problem, and it gets to be a worse problem in the 1760s. You know, the South Carolinians of the western part of the state actually put together themselves, they call themselves the Regulators, right? And they say, because we are going to regulate and control and act as the police force ourselves here in the West. And basically, they put together citizen militias that act as patrols and basically enact vigilante justice, right? There's a lot of lynching, a lot of tracking people down. They act as both guards. And, you know, they make an actual appeal, many appeals to the political powers in the eastern part of the state, right? To the governor and specifically to the South Carolina Assembly, saying, hey, we spend all this money in taxes. You need to give us some law and order out here. It's very specific. And they say, and if you don't do it, we will govern ourselves. And we won't pay any taxes either, which is the other thing. So they say, we're basically our own independent group out here until we get some sort of sign that the eastern part of the state cares. Well, by the late 1760s, early 1770s, it actually works. It works in two ways. One, vigilante justice, although immoral, can actually be somewhat effective in the short run in curtailing lawlessness and banditry. The second thing that happens is the South Carolinian government, the colonial authority, and the assembly give in. They say, yeah, okay, you guys are right. And in fact, they do put forth the money. They establish 4 circuit courts on the frontier, along with a jail system. They actually work with these militias, giving them some legitimacy as a police force. And it does actually help to stabilize the frontier of South Carolina, right, once again. And once this happens, they don't continue to be this sort of vigilante and out of control, you know, violent group, right? And they don't become marauders, and they don't run an organized crime style protection racket either, right? They actually, most of them go back to farming and living their stable life as backcountry settler farmers. The North Carolina one will be even a little different. In North Carolina, they will also call themselves Regulators, based on these guys. They take on a similar name. But the North Carolina divide is more specific, is that there's actually more of a political ideology that goes with this one. And in the late 1760s, North Carolina's population, western part of the state's population, is really large. And they know that they are overly taxed and underrepresented in the colonial assembly, right? And as we know, the traditional notion of the assembly now is that the assembly should be this democratic body that represents the interests, right, of white colonial settlers against external powers, right, against England and its imperial designs. And what they say is, you're not functioning the way you're supposed to. They look at this, they say, we're underrepresented and we're paying taxes. I mean, this is, you know, an iteration of, you know, no taxation without representation, right? We are underrepresented, and yet we're paying a too high of a proportion of the taxes to the state. Plus, we're poorer to begin with. And in fact, they were right, right? They're right that the eastern powers that be, the business power, the business interests, and the political powers were in fact colluding to basically bilk the northern farmers out of their tax money, right? It is unfair. And the reaction to this is really martial. They actually raise an army. That they put together an army called the Regulators. And they will put together an army of about 2,500 volunteer men. Again, these are backcountry farmers and settlers who take up their arms, organize themselves really quickly, right, into a military force, and they march towards the eastern part of the state to press their concerns, right, to press their rights. The governor and the leaders in the assembly are aware that they're coming. They don't have a standing army. They don't really have a very effective police force. They turn to their local population saying, hey, listen, there's a threat to our way of life and our community heading our way in the form of these Regulators. They're able to raise up a volunteer army of 1,500 men. And they march out to meet this army of Regulators. And it's actually one of the largest battles amongst colonists, right? And it's on May 16th, 1771, and you see how close we are getting to the Revolution here, and this is a pretty major battle amongst colonists to be happening already. There's something called the Battle of Alamance. And basically, it's these two forces, the forces of the regulators, 2,500 colonial volunteers, and this should be familiar once we get into the Revolution, this idea of colonial militiamen and volunteers, right? Versus another group of colonial volunteers representing the eastern powers of the state. They will clash in a one-day battle. 300 people will die. 300 people. The eastern forces win. They actually disperse the regulators and drive them back. Neither side, after which, turns towards marauding or pursuing the other one. It kind of actually settles the issue for the time being. You know, the division between the western part of the state and the eastern part of the state will continue to be played out during the Revolution itself. And it'll actually, in many ways, be the split between loyalists and patriots will be east and west as well, with the east being more loyalist inclined in North Carolina. But again, this is an example of how quickly and extensively, on the eve of the Revolution, the colonists are willing to and able to put together military force, communal, focused, directed military force to press their concerns. In this case, it's political rights, traditional political concerns, actually contemporary political concerns for them, this idea of what the assembly should do, how representation should be proportioned, or I should say apportioned, and you know, the nature of taxation, right? So this is actually somewhat of a contemporary thing. But again, we see this pattern already in place. So let's look at all of these. One, there's certain things that clearly would elicit this sort of communal response, right? And just so we can say what they are. And you'll remember which one goes with the Stono Rebellion, which one goes with the Regulators or land riots, right? But one, anything that directly threatened the health and well-being, like the biological health and well-being, I mean, of a community. A slave insurrection, right? Something along those lines. I mean, that direct, immediate threat would elicit a response like this. The community, and community in that small sense, sense of the word, really tight, would respond with collective focused violence to address that threat. Rightfully or wrongfully. And that is not to say that the institution of slavery should have been upheld this way at all, or anyway, right? But this is just to sort of look at how it functions, an example of how it functions. That's the Stono Rebellion is a perfect example of this. How quickly and willing they were to address this threat. And once that threat is met, they recede back into what they were doing before, right? They didn't allow their passions to overcome the pragmatic cultural function of communal focused violence, how it worked in the colonies. Secondly, anytime there was a need to impose law and order where traditional powers couldn't or just wouldn't impose law and order. You know, again, the colonies are remote. They're not in England or in Europe. Much of the colonies, especially the ones not right in the seaboard towns themselves, are outside of everyday infrastructure and institutions of authority, of law and order, of stability, courts and police and soldiers, right? Sort of just a general stability of living in one type of society. And communities would take it upon themselves to be the enactors, the sustainers of law and order. You know, stability and permanence and security had the highest priorities of all, right? And any of those were threatened or apparently in jeopardy, real or imagined. Once that was what the community felt, you would very often see this violent response, collective, focused, pragmatic, violent response. And because of the nature of the colonies, socially, geographically, these responses tended to be successful. They had the desired effect. You know, the third thing we often see too, and this is really becomes more and more developed in the 18th century. I really feel this is part of an 18th century experience in the colonies, is that willingness to take this sort of traditional response to biological threats or the need for law and order, which I think pre-exist, even come from Old English communities, quite honestly. But this new idea that also a threat to the community could be a challenge to your traditional rights, particularly your right to own and occupy land, which is at the heart of the Revolution. You know, your rights to self-government, your right to be protected from an external authority. And that's another thing. Whenever the threat came from an external power, you know, faraway patroon landowners who lived in Albany the British government, the government of New York, you know, the Eastern politicians in South and North Carolina. That idea of there's sort of an us on the inside and a them out there, and they threaten us and our rights. This is where you really see this quick, focused, and actually if we look at it, the Green Mountain Boys and the Regulator movement, the largest violent reaction would be a threat to those rights. And they get larger and larger as we get closer to the revolution, right? The Green Mountain Boys in Vermont and the Regulators in North Carolina are thousands of people involved in this. And yet, even as their numbers got larger, they retained one of the most important parts of, as far as the American Revolution story goes, that idea of restraint, of focus. Now, let me be quite clear. It is not to say that acts of passion and violence never happened. They certainly happened throughout the entire American Revolution. However, the entire population doesn't have this cathartic, vengeful unleashing of popular, passionate violence, right, that drives a lot of other revolutions that were harnessed by many other revolutions in order to overthrow the ancient regime or the czars or imperialist China or what have you, right? The American Revolution doesn't really have that, right? In fact, what they harness is this more traditional, pragmatic, and I would argue restrained sense of focused and efficacious communal violence. And they do it really well. And that is why, or it is one of the reasons why, there's no one that is why, but it is one of the reasons why, as the Revolutionary War winds down, I mean, and I said well before we signed the Treaty of Paris, right, after the Battle of Yorktown, the colonists and the new, Americans scale back their violence drastically, return to an incredible level of stability in light of the fact they just fought 6 or 7 years of completely unstable warfare. And like that, they recede back into this sort of stable, secure world, right, which is what they were fighting to preserve in the first place. They've obviously been changed by the experience of war. The ideas of egalitarianism and non-monarchical democracy are now realities. A revolution definitely happened. And yet, somewhere in this revolution, because of pre-existing culture, there was a moderating element, a focused and effective element, an element that would react quickly by whole communities, by loyalists and patriots alike, by the way. And yet, this moderating element, the limits on communal violence, because stability being the ultimate goal, come to the fore. And they give us yet another way to piece together the why as well as the how of the American Revolution. Thank you.